The impact came suddenly, a sickening thud that shuddered through the entire car. Walter Sullivan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his headlights catching a blur of golden fur tumbling into the darkness beyond the shoulder. Time seemed to stop. In that frozen moment, the 63-year-old man saw a pair of eyes reflecting in his rearview mirror. Not filled with fear, but with something far worse. Recognition. The fog on Seaside Avenue swirled around his sedan like ghostly fingers, as if trying to hold him in place. Walter's breath came in short, panicked bursts. Stay or flee? Face what he'd done or disappear into the night? His foot hovered over the brake pedal for one agonizing second before slamming down on the accelerator instead. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The tires squealed on the wet pavement as Walter's blue Buick shot forward into the thickening fog. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. What had he hit? A dog, certainly, but what if it belonged to someone? What if it was wearing a collar with an address, a phone number, a name? It was an accident, he whispered to the empty car, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. You couldn't see anything in this fog. No one could. The excuses felt paper-thin, dissolving in the moisture of his breath. Walter's eyes kept darting to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the animal following him, or worse, its owner. But there was only darkness behind him, the road swallowed by Maine's notorious coastal fog. Walter Sullivan had been a history professor before retirement 3 years ago. He had spent his career teaching about the consequences of human decisions, about how single moments could alter the course of entire civilizations. Now, he was living through one of those moments, his moment, and he had chosen to run. Outside, the mist draped itself over the cliffs and pines that lined Seaside Avenue, the infamous stretch of coastal road locales called Death Curve. Walter knew its reputation well, 17 lives claimed in the past decade, including his wife Elizabeth and son Michael 7 years prior. He had avoided this road religiously since the accident that took them, until tonight when a sudden rainstorm had forced him to take this shortcut home from his weekly grocery run. 20 minutes later, Walter pulled into the driveway of his colonial-style house on the outskirts of Portland. The home that had once resonated with laughter now stood as a mausoleum to his former life. The motion-detecting porch light flickered on as he approached, illuminating the raindrops that pelted the stone walkway. His hands were still trembling as he fumbled with his keys. Inside, Walter didn't bother turning on the lights. He went straight to the kitchen cabinet where he kept a bottle of scotch for nights like this, though there had never really been a night quite like this before. He poured himself a generous glass and drank half of it in one burning gulp. The alcohol couldn't wash away what he'd done, but it softened the edges of his guilt just enough that he could function. He needed to check the car, to see if there was damage, to know what he was dealing with. Walking back outside with the rain still coming down, Walter switched on his phone's flashlight and inspected the front of his Buick. His breath caught in his throat. There, embedded in the chrome bumper, was a tuft of golden red fur matted with something darker. Blood. And caught on the license plate, a small piece of torn fabric, green nylon with a metal buckle still attached. A fragment of a dog collar. Walter carefully removed the piece, his fingers numb from more than just the cold rain. He turned it over in his palm, his flashlight revealing a partial engraving. Rusty, he whispered, giving life and identity to the animal he'd struck. Your name was Rusty. Back inside, Walter placed the collar fragment on his kitchen table and stared at it. Water dripped from his rain-soaked hair down his face like tears he couldn't shed. He hadn't cried since the funeral 7 years ago. Something inside him had dried up that day, leaving only a hollow space where emotion should be. That night sleep eluded Walter. He lay in bed listening to the storm outside his window, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against glass merging with the thudding of his guilty conscience. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pair of reflective eyes in his rearview mirror, not accusatory, but somehow knowing, as if the dog had been waiting for him. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. when Walter finally gave up trying to sleep. He padded downstairs in his slippers, made a cup of tea he wouldn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table across from the collar fragment that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine New England morning that mocked Walter's inner turmoil. Sunlight streamed through his kitchen window, catching on the metal of the collar buckle, sending a sharp reflection across the room. It felt like a signal, a calling. Walter knew what he had to do. The realization settled over him with the weight of inevitability. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could face it. For the first time in 7 years, he would willingly return to Death Curve. As Walter got dressed, he caught his reflection in the bedroom mirror, a man he barely recognized, gray hair that had once been chestnut brown, deep lines etched around hollow eyes, shoulders permanently stooped as if carrying an invisible burden. Today, that burden had a name, Rusty. He grabbed his car keys from the hook by the door, the piece of collar secure in his pocket. His palms were slick with sweat as he started the Buick's engine. The familiar rumble seemed louder this morning, accusatory. "I'm going back," he said to the empty passenger seat where Elizabeth used to sit. "I have to make this right." What Walter didn't know was that his return to Seaside Avenue would set in motion events that would connect past and present, the living and the lost, in ways he could never imagine. The dog named Rusty was more than just an animal he'd struck on a foggy night. He was the key to a mystery that had begun long before their violent encounter, a mystery that would finally force Walter Sullivan to confront the ghosts he'd been running from for 7 long years. The Buick pulled away from the curb, carrying Walter toward a reckoning that had been waiting for him since that night 7 years ago when Death Curve had first taken everything he loved. The morning sky over Portland hung heavy with leaden clouds, perfectly mirroring Walter's state of mind as he drove toward Seaside Avenue. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from age, but from dread. Each mile marker brought him closer to the scene of last night's accident, closer to confronting what he had done. Walter had spent 7 years avoiding this stretch of road. Now, as the Buick rounded the bend that led to Death Curve, memories assaulted him from all sides. This was where the guardrail had failed 7 years ago. This was where Elizabeth had screamed his name in that final moment. This was where Michael had been sitting, headphones on, unaware that his young life was about to end. "Focus," Walter muttered to himself, forcing his attention back to the present. "You're here for Rusty." He slowed the car as he approached the approximate location of last night's impact. In daylight, without the fog, Seaside Avenue revealed its treacherous beauty. To the right, jagged cliffs dropped to the Atlantic Ocean, waves crashing against the rocks below. To the left, dense pine forest pressed close to the roadside, creating deep shadows even in daytime. Walter pulled onto the narrow shoulder and turned on his hazard lights. The knot in his stomach tightened as he stepped out of the car. The air smelled of salt and pine, crisp in his lungs. He scanned the asphalt, quickly spotting dark stains where the rain hadn't completely washed away the evidence. Blood. Rusty's blood. Walter followed the trail with his eyes. It veered toward the forest edge, disappearing into the underbrush. Taking a deep breath, he left the safety of the roadside and pushed into the trees, ducking under low-hanging branches. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. What was he expecting? That the dog would answer? Only the distant sound of waves and the occasional call of a gull replied. Walter pressed forward, following broken twigs and disturbed undergrowth. The trail seemed deliberate, as if the injured animal had been seeking shelter deeper in the woods rather than wandering aimlessly. After about 20 yards, Walter froze. There, in a small clearing beneath an ancient oak, lay a golden shape. Rusty. The dog was curled on its side, fur matted, with dried blood, eyes closed. Walter's heart sank. He was too late, but then a miracle. As Walter approached, Rusty's ribcage expanded with a shallow breath. One eye opened, revealing a deep amber iris that fixed on Walter with the same strange recognition he'd glimpsed in his rearview mirror. "You're alive," Walter whispered, his voice catching. He knelt beside the injured animal, hesitantly reaching out a hand. Rusty made no attempt to move away. Instead, the dog released a soft whimper that seemed to say, "I've been waiting for you." Walter gently ran his fingers over the dog's body, assessing the damage. A deep gash ran along Rusty's flank, and one leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The collar was indeed green, matching the fragment in Walter's pocket, but the tag was missing. Despite the injuries, Walter could tell this was no stray. The dog's coat, though dirty and bloodied, showed signs of regular grooming, and its healthy weight suggested proper care. "I'm going to help you," Walter said, surprising himself with the determination in his voice. "I'm not running away this time." With careful movements, Walter removed his jacket and laid it beside the dog. Rusty watched him, those intelligent eyes never leaving Walter's face. When Walter gently eased his arms beneath the dog's body, Rusty whimpered but made no attempt to resist. "I know it hurts," Walter soothed, lifting the injured animal as carefully as possible. "Just hold on a little longer." The dog was heavier than Walter expected, solid muscle beneath the golden fur. As he carried Rusty back toward the car, Walter felt something shift inside him, a crack in the protective shell he'd built around his heart since the funeral. This wounded creature depended on him now. For the first time in 7 years, someone needed Walter Sullivan. At the car, Walter hesitated. The passenger seat where Elizabeth had died seemed wrong somehow. Instead, he carefully laid Rusty across the back seat, arranging his jacket to cushion the dog's injured leg. "We need to find you a vet," he said, sliding behind the wheel. "Just stay with me." As the Buick pulled back onto Seaside Avenue, Walter realized he had no idea where the nearest veterinary clinic might be. In his emotional isolation, he'd lost touch with such practical knowledge. He fumbled for his phone, grateful for modern technology as he searched for Emergency Vet, Portland, Maine. The closest option was Casco Bay Veterinary Hospital, 15 minutes away. Walter glanced in the rearview mirror at Rusty, whose breathing seemed more labored now. "Hang on, boy. 15 minutes. You can do that." Every traffic light felt like an eternity. Walter found himself talking continuously to Rusty, partly to keep the dog conscious and partly to distract himself from the growing fear that he would be responsible for yet another death. "I used to have a dog when I was a kid," Walter said, turning onto Commercial Street. "A beagle named Charlie. Not as handsome as you, but a good dog. Elizabeth was allergic, so Michael never got to have one." Walter's voice trailed off as emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He cleared his throat. "Almost there, Rusty. Almost there." The veterinary hospital appeared ahead, a modern building with large windows and a blue awning. Walter parked haphazardly across 2 spaces near the entrance, caring nothing for propriety now. As he carefully lifted Rusty from the back seat, he felt the dog go limp in his arms. "No, no, no," Walter murmured, hurrying toward the entrance. "Stay with me, Rusty." "We made it. Don't give up now." The automatic doors slid open and Walter stepped into the bright reception area, cradling the injured dog against his chest. Blood seeped through his shirt, warm and sticky against his skin. A young woman behind the desk looked up, her expression changing from professional welcome to alarm in an instant. "Please," Walter said, his voice breaking. "He needs help." The reception area of Casco Bay Veterinary Hospital blurred around Walter as the young woman behind the desk rushed to his side. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the intercom button. "Car accident," Walter managed, his voice thick with shame. "Last night. I found him this morning." The receptionist pressed the button. "Dr. Henderson to reception, Stat. We have an emergency." She gestured toward a door. This way, please. Walter followed her through swinging doors into a sterile examination room. The antiseptic smell reminded him of another emergency room, another night when he had carried precious cargo in his arms. He pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the shallow rise and fall of Rusty's chest. You can put him here, the receptionist said, indicating an examination table covered with a clean blue pad. Walter hesitated, reluctant to let go. When he finally laid Rusty down, the dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, finding Walter's face before closing again. A low whimper escaped from his throat. I'm not leaving, Walter said, as much to Rusty as to the receptionist. Before she could respond, the door swung open and a woman in her 50s entered. She wore a white coat with Dr. Martha Henderson, DVM, embroidered on the pocket, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her expression was professionally neutral as she quickly assessed the situation. What's his name? She asked, already examining Rusty's injuries with gentle, practiced hands. Rusty, Walter replied. At least I think so. I found a piece of his collar. Dr. Henderson nodded, her focus unwavering. And you are? Walter Sullivan. He faltered. He was hit by a car. Something in Walter's tone made Dr. Henderson glance up, her sharp eyes studying him, for a moment before returning to her patient. She didn't press for details. Cassie, I need a full trauma kit and x-ray prep, she said to the receptionist, who nodded and left quickly. Dr. Henderson continued her examination, speaking in a calm, steady voice. Multiple fractured ribs, possible internal bleeding. His left hind leg is definitely broken. She gently lifted one of Rusty's eyelids. He's in shock. The door opened again as Cassie returned with another staff member, both pushing carts laden with medical equipment. Dr. Henderson turned to Walter. Mr. Sullivan, I need to ask you to wait outside now. We need to stabilize him and get some images to assess the full extent of his injuries. Walter nodded, suddenly aware of the blood staining his clothes, the trembling in his hands. Will he... He couldn't finish the question. Dr. Henderson's expression softened slightly. He's lost a lot of blood, and he's been injured for quite some time. But golden retrievers are resilient, and this one seems like a fighter. She nodded toward the door. Cassie will show you where you can clean up. We'll do everything we can. In the small bathroom off the waiting area, Walter stared at his reflection in the mirror. Blood, Rusty's blood, had soaked through his shirt and dried in dark patches on his hands. He looked haunted, older than his 63 years. Methodically, he washed his hands, watching the water in the sink turn pink, then clear. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the fatigue and guilt. When he emerged, the waiting room was mercifully empty. Walter sank into a chair in the corner, his body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. On the wall across from him hung a bulletin board covered with photos of pets and their owners. Success stories, he assumed. Happy endings. Did Rusty have an owner somewhere, wondering what had happened to their beloved pet? The thought twisted in Walter's gut like a knife. He should have stopped last night. He should have checked immediately. If Rusty died because of those lost hours... Walter didn't realize he had dozed off until a gentle hand on his shoulder startled him awake. Dr. Henderson stood over him, her face showing the strain of intense focus. Mr. Sullivan? Walter sat up quickly. How is he? Dr. Henderson sat in the chair beside him. He's stable, for now. The next 24 hours will be critical. He has 3 broken ribs, a fractured femur in his left hind leg, and some internal bruising, but miraculously, no major organ damage. She paused. He's also severely dehydrated, suggesting he's been out there longer than just since last night. Walter frowned. That's impossible. The accident was last night. Based on the state of his injuries and his condition, I'd estimate he's been without proper care for at least 3 days, possibly longer. Her eyes held Walter's steadily. And there's something else. He has an old scar on his head that appears to be from a previous injury. This dog has been through a lot. Walter's mind raced. 3 days? That didn't make sense. But he pushed this puzzle aside for the moment. What happens now? We need to set his leg surgically and monitor him closely for any signs of complications. Dr. Henderson hesitated. Mr. Sullivan, I should be clear. The treatment he needs will be expensive. And without knowing if he has an owner, I'll cover all costs, Walter said without hesitation. Do whatever needs to be done. Dr. Henderson studied him for a moment, seeming to weigh something in her mind. We'll check for a microchip when he's more stable. In the meantime, I'll need a deposit and some paperwork filled out. Walter nodded, reaching for his wallet. Only then did he realize the full implication of what he was doing. Taking responsibility for a dog he had injured, a dog that might belong to someone else, a dog that represented the guilt he had been avoiding for years. Yet as he followed Cassie to the reception desk to handle the paperwork, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. For 7 years he had been going through the motions of living, teaching his classes until retirement, maintaining his home, existing but not truly alive. Now, in trying to save Rusty, he felt the first stirrings of something like meaning. He completed the forms mechanically, listing his contact information and signing his name on the treatment authorization. When he came to the field labeled Owner's Relationship to Patient, Walter hesitated, pen hovering over the paper. After a moment, he wrote simply, Responsible. After arranging to be called with updates, Walter stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. The day had warmed, burning away the morning clouds. He stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, suddenly unsure where to go or what to do next. The adrenaline that had carried him through the morning was draining away, leaving him empty and uncertain. But as he slid behind the wheel of his Buick, Walter knew he couldn't simply go home and wait. There were questions that needed answers. Who did Rusty belong to? How had he ended up on Death Curve? And why did Walter feel such a powerful connection to this dog he had known for less than a day? Starting the engine, Walter made a decision. He would return to Seaside Avenue one more time, not to the scene of the accident, but to the neighborhood nearby. Someone there might recognize Rusty, might be missing their golden retriever with soulful amber eyes. As he pulled out of the veterinary hospital parking lot, Walter didn't notice the elderly woman watching him from a bench across the street, her weathered face thoughtful as she noted his license plate number in a small notebook, the first tenuous thread in a tapestry of connections that would soon begin to weave Walter's fate with others touched by Death Curve. 3 days passed before Dr. Henderson called Walter, with the news that Rusty was stable enough for visitors. During that time, Walter had driven through the neighborhood surrounding Seaside Avenue, stopping at houses to show a photo of Rusty he'd taken on his phone before leaving the dog at the veterinary hospital. No one recognized the golden retriever, or at least no one admitted to it. When Walter entered the recovery room at Casco Bay Veterinary Hospital, he was unprepared for the surge of emotion that hit him at the sight of Rusty. The dog lay on a padded bed, his left hind leg in a cast, tubes and monitors attached to his body. Yet despite these signs of trauma, Rusty's eyes brightened upon seeing Walter, and his tail gave a feeble but unmistakable wag. "He knows you," Dr. Henderson remarked, standing beside Walter. "That's a good sign." Walter approached cautiously, extending his hand for Rusty to sniff. The dog licked his fingers weakly, and something tightened in Walter's chest. "The surgery went well," Dr. Henderson continued. "We were able to set the leg with pins. The ribs will heal on their own with time. He's young, probably 4 or 5 years old, and in good health otherwise, which is in his favor." "Did you find a microchip?" Walter asked, gently stroking the fur between Rusty's ears. Dr. Henderson shook her head. "No chip. And we checked with local shelters and rescue groups. No one has reported a missing golden retriever matching his description." Walter nodded, absently rubbing the spot where Rusty's collar had been. The hospital had replaced it with a soft blue bandana tied loosely around his neck. "He'll need several weeks of recovery," Dr. Henderson said. "We can keep him here, or—" I'll take him, Walter said without hesitation, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. When he's ready, of course. Dr. Henderson studied him thoughtfully. Have you ever owned a dog, Mr. Sullivan? A long time ago. And please, call me Walter. Martha, she offered in return. She checked something on Rusty's chart. He should be ready to leave in another 3 or 4 days, assuming no complications. In the meantime, you're welcome to visit him daily. It will help his recovery to have someone he trusts nearby. Someone he trusts. The words echoed in Walter's mind as he sat beside Rusty's bed, carefully stroking the dog's golden coat. Why did this animal trust him, the very person who had caused his injuries? There was something uncanny about the way Rusty looked at him, as if the dog knew something Walter didn't. Walter began visiting Rusty every day, bringing special treats approved by Martha, and spending hours simply sitting beside the dog, talking softly about nothing in particular. He found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, about Elizabeth's laugh, about Michael's passion for astronomy, about the life they'd built together and the void left behind. Rusty listened with what seemed like genuine interest, his amber eyes fixed on Walter's face, occasionally offering a sympathetic whine or a gentle nudge with his nose when Walter's voice faltered. On the 5th day, as Walter was leaving the hospital after his visit, Martha stopped him in the hallway. Rusty's doing remarkably well, she said. His resilience is unusual, to say the least. I think he could go home with you tomorrow, if you're ready. Walter nodded, a mix of nervousness and anticipation stirring in his chest. I've been preparing the house. I bought a bed, food, toys, probably too many toys. Martha smiled. It's good to see you taking this so seriously, but I'm curious. You've gone to considerable effort to find his owner, yet you seem quite attached to him already. Walter hesitated, unsure how to explain the connection he felt to Rusty. I feel responsible for him, he said finally. Not just because of the accident, but it's like he found me for a reason. Instead of dismissing his sentiment as fanciful, Martha nodded thoughtfully. Animals sometimes seem to know things we don't, she said, especially the bright ones like Rusty. As Walter turned to leave, Martha added, One more thing. I noticed something odd while examining him yesterday. There's a small area on his neck where the fur pattern is disrupted. It could be from an old injury, but it almost looks like he might have had a different collar at some point, one that was left on too long. Walter frowned. You think he might have had more than one owner? It's possible, given his general health and temperament. He was clearly well cared for, but that mark suggests there might be more to his story. This new mystery occupied Walter's thoughts as he drove home that evening. He took a different route, avoiding Seaside Avenue as he had for the past week, but still found himself thinking about the circumstances that had brought Rusty into his life. On impulse, Walter detoured through a neighborhood near Death Curve that he hadn't yet canvassed. The area was older, with well-maintained Victorian homes set back from tree-lined streets. As he drove slowly down Mariner's Lane, he noticed an elderly woman tending to a garden filled with late summer blooms. Walter parked and approached the white picket fence surrounding her yard. Excuse me, he called. I wonder if I might ask you a question. The woman straightened up, pressing a hand against her lower back as she turned to face him. She was small but sturdy-looking, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed Walter with surprising acuity. You're the man with the blue Buick, she said, her voice stronger than her fragile appearance suggested. The one who took the golden retriever to Casco Bay Veterinary. Walter stared at her in surprise. How did you... I'm Eleanor Simmons. I've lived in this house for 60 years, young man. Not much happens around Seaside Avenue that I don't know about. She gestured toward her porch. You'd better come sit down. I think we have things to discuss about that dog you found. As Walter followed Eleanor toward her house, he felt as if he were stepping across an invisible threshold, not just onto her porch, but into a deeper connection with whatever mystery surrounded Rusty and Death Curve. The first piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. Eleanor Simmons' living room was like stepping into another era. Floral wallpaper, doilies on armrests, and photographs in ornate frames filled every surface. Walter sat perched on an antique sofa, cradling a delicate teacup that seemed too small for his hands. 3 years ago, Eleanor began without preamble, a family called the Harpers lived in the Blue Victorian 3 blocks from here, Thomas and Margaret Harper and their daughter Sophie. She poured tea from a silver pot with practiced precision. Sophie was 12, bright, imaginative, always, with that golden retriever of hers. Walter's hands tightened around the teacup. A golden retriever? Eleanor nodded, her eyes sharp beneath wrinkled lids. Called him Scout. That dog followed Sophie everywhere, to school, to the beach, even waited outside when she had piano lessons at Mrs. Abernathy's. What happened to them? Walter asked, already dreading the answer. Eleanor set down her teacup with a faint clink. Car accident on Seaside Avenue, right at that cursed curve. She made a small sign of the cross. Sophie was killed instantly. Margaret never recovered from the shock. Had a heart attack 6 months later. Thomas sold the house and moved away. Bar Harbor, I believe. Walter's mind raced. Could Rusty be this Scout? The timing seemed plausible, but why had the dog been on death curve 3 days before Walter hit him? Do you have a photo of Scout? He asked. Eleanor rose slowly and crossed to a bureau where she extracted a community newsletter. Summer festival, 3 years ago, she explained, pointing to a photo. That's Sophie with Scout. Walter stared at the image of a smiling girl with auburn braids, her arm around a golden retriever that looked strikingly similar to Rusty. The dog wore a green collar. Mrs. Simmons, did Scout disappear after the accident? Before, Eleanor corrected. 2 days before. That's what made it all the more tragic. Sophie insisted on going out to look for Scout that night. Thomas was driving her around searching when the accident happened. Walter felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Scout had disappeared before Sophie's death, yet somehow ended up on the same stretch of road 3 years later, only to be hit by Walter. There's something else, Eleanor said, studying Walter's face. You're not the first person who's come asking about that dog. Last week a man was here, said he was a relative of the Harpers looking for information. Walter frowned. Did he give a name? Eleanor shook her head. But there was something familiar about him. And he asked specifically about Scout, whether the dog had ever been found. Later that afternoon, Walter sat in the Portland Public Library, staring at a microfiche screen displaying a 3-year-old issue of the Portland Press-Herald. The headline was small, relegated to page 3. Local girl killed in Seaside Avenue crash. The article was brief, noting that a 12-year-old Sophie Harper had died when her father's car veered off the road at the curve locals called Death Curve. Thomas Harper had survived with minor injuries. The article mentioned that 17 fatal accidents had occurred on that stretch in the past decade, prompting renewed calls for safety improvements that had yet to be implemented. Walter printed the article, then searched for follow-up stories. He found a short piece about Margaret Harper's funeral 6 months later, which mentioned she never recovered from the loss of her only child. A subsequent article noted that Thomas Harper had sold their home and left Portland to escape the memories. Nothing about Scout. That evening, Walter brought Rusty home from the veterinary hospital. The dog seemed to approve of Walter's colonial house, sniffing each room with interest despite his cast and bandages. Walter had prepared a plush bed in the living room, but when night fell, Rusty hobbled upstairs and settled determinedly beside Walter's bed. All right, you win, Walter conceded, helping the dog onto a blanket he arranged on the floor. Just until you're healed. That night, Walter dreamed of Seaside Avenue. In the dream, he was driving through thick fog, but instead of hitting Rusty, he saw a young girl standing in the middle of the road, Sophie Harper, exactly as she looked in the festival photo. Beside her stood Rusty, or Scout, wearing both collars, the green one from the photo and the blue bandana from the hospital. Sophie's lips moved as if she were speaking, but Walter couldn't hear her words. He woke with a start to find Rusty standing beside the bed, whining softly, his amber eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. "What is it, boy?" Walter whispered, reaching out to stroke the dog's head. Rusty nudged Walter's hand insistently, then turned toward the window. Outside fog had rolled in from the ocean, cloaking Portland in a ghostly shroud. Walter's dream lingered in his mind as he followed Rusty's gaze. "Is that what you're trying to tell me about Sophie?" At the sound of the name, Rusty's ears perked up. He turned to Walter and made a soft, chuffing noise, almost like an affirmation. "Scout?" Walter tried, watching carefully. The dog's reaction was unmistakable. A vigorous tail wag despite his injuries. A chill ran down Walter's spine. The dog recognized both names. Somehow, Rusty and Scout were the same animal. But how had he survived for 3 years, and why had he appeared on Death Curve at the exact moment Walter was passing by? The next morning, Walter called Martha Henderson. "I need to ask you about Rusty's age," he said after explaining what he'd learned from Eleanor Simmons. "You estimated he was 4 or 5 years old. Could he be older? Say 7 or 8? "It's possible," Martha conceded. "Golden retrievers maintain their youthful appearance longer than some breeds. I'd need to examine his teeth more thoroughly." "But Walter, are you suggesting this is the same dog from 3 years ago? Where has he been all this time?" "I don't know," Walter admitted, "but I intend to find out." After hanging up, Walter turned to find Rusty sitting in the doorway, watching him with those knowing eyes. The dog, Scouter Rusty, whatever his name truly was, held secrets that somehow connected to Walter's own tragedy on Death Curve. "We need to find Thomas Harper," Walter told the dog, who thumped his tail in what seemed like agreement. "He might have the answers we're looking for." As if in response, Rusty limped to the front door and scratched at it once, decisively. Walter nodded, a strange certainty settling over him. "You're right. It's time to go back to Seaside Avenue." What Walter didn't yet understand was that the connection between him, the dog, and Death Curve ran much deeper than he imagined, back to a time long before Sophie Harper, before even Walter's own family tragedy. And the answers he sought would ultimately force him to confront the grief he had locked away 7 years ago, when his world had ended on that same cursed stretch of road. The morning fog still clung to Seaside Avenue as Walter's Buick approached Death Curve. Rusty sat in the passenger seat, his bandaged leg extended awkwardly in front of him, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. The dog had been uncharacteristically restless all morning, as if sensing the importance of their journey. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel as they neared the fatal curve. He hadn't driven this stretch of road in daylight since the accident that took Elizabeth and Michael. Even now, 7 years later, his chest constricted as memories flooded back. Elizabeth's laugh as they'd set out that morning, Michael's excitement about the astronomy exhibit they were heading to see, the sudden screech of tires on wet pavement, the horrifying sensation of the car spinning out of control. "Easy, Walter," he murmured to himself as much as to Rusty. "We're just here to understand." He pulled onto the same shoulder where he'd found Rusty a week earlier. The area looked different in the morning light, less ominous but somehow more melancholy. The ocean stretched out beyond the cliffs, a vast blue expanse that seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world. Walter sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Beside him, Rusty whined softly. "I know, boy. I don't want to be here either." With a deep breath, Walter opened his door and came around to help Rusty out of the car. The dog moved gingerly on 3 legs, but his determination was evident as he led Walter not toward the forest where he had been found, but toward the curve itself. At the sharpest point of the bend, Rusty stopped. The dog turned his head to look up at Walter, then back at the road, as if trying to communicate something essential. Walter surveyed the area, seeing it with new eyes. The guardrail here was newer than the rest, replaced after numerous accidents, no doubt. Below the cliff edge, jagged rocks met the churning Atlantic. The road itself seemed innocent enough, a simple curve that shouldn't be dangerous to a careful driver. Yet something about this place had claimed so many lives. "This is where it happened, isn't it?" Walter said quietly. "Where I lost them. Where Sophie died." At the mention of Sophie's name, Rusty let out a soft whimper. Walter knelt beside the dog, running his hand gently over the golden fur. "You know something about this place, about all of us who lost someone here." The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and pine, and for a moment Walter could almost believe he wasn't alone, that Elizabeth and Michael were somehow present, watching him from beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead. Then, without warning, the memories he had suppressed for 7 years burst through the walls he had built around them. Walter sank to his knees on the gravel shoulder, overcome by grief so raw it felt as if the accident had happened yesterday. He remembered the seconds after impact, the eerie silence, the taste of blood in his mouth, the knowledge even before he turned his head that Elizabeth and Michael were gone. He remembered the firefighters cutting through metal to free him from the wreckage, the pitying looks from the paramedics, the terrible hollow days that followed. But most of all, he remembered what he had tried hardest to forget, the fact that he had been arguing with Elizabeth when the car went off the road. A stupid, trivial disagreement about retirement plans that had escalated because of his stubborn pride. His last words to her had been spoken in anger, his attention diverted from the road for that crucial second. "It was my fault," Walter whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "All my fault." Rusty pressed against him, offering canine comfort, his warm presence anchoring Walter to the present moment. The dog licked away a tear from Walter's cheek, his eyes full of what seemed like understanding beyond animal capacity. They stayed like that for several minutes, man and dog connected in mutual grief. When Walter finally stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, he felt different, as if a poisonous wound had been lanced, allowing the first tentative steps toward genuine healing. "Thank you," he said to Rusty, unsure exactly what he was thanking the dog for, but feeling the gratitude nonetheless. As they turned to go back to the car, Walter noticed something glinting in the gravel near the guardrail. He bent to examine it, a small metal object half buried in the soil. Carefully, he dug it out. It was a heart-shaped locket, tarnished with age and exposure. Walter pried it open with his thumbnail. Inside was a tiny photograph of a smiling girl with auburn braids, Sophie Harper, and a small coil of golden fur, undoubtedly from Scout. Walter's hand trembled as he held the locket. "How is this possible?" he murmured, looking at Rusty. "This connection between us all?" Rusty nudged Walter's hand as if urging him to keep the locket. Walter slipped it into his pocket, a tangible link to the mystery they were unraveling together. Back in the car, Walter sat for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The raw emotion of confronting his memories at Death Curve had left him drained, but also strangely clear-headed. He knew now what they needed to do next. "We need to find Thomas Harper," he told Rusty. "Eleanor said he moved to Bar Harbor." Walter started the engine, his decision made, but instead of turning back toward Portland, he found himself continuing along Seaside Avenue, away from the city. Something compelled him to drive the route his family had taken that last day, to follow the road they never got to finish. As they drove, Walter began to talk, telling Rusty about Elizabeth and Michael. Not about their deaths, but about their lives. The camping trips they'd taken to Acadia National Park, Michael's fascination with the stars, Elizabeth's talent for finding four-leaf clovers. Stories he hadn't shared with anyone in 7 years. Rusty listened attentively, his head tilted as if absorbing every word. Occasionally he would make a soft sound of encouragement when Walter's voice faltered. By the time they reached the junction where Seaside Avenue met the main coastal highway, Walter felt as if he had taken the first step on a journey he should have begun years ago. Not just the physical journey to find Thomas Harper, but the emotional journey toward acceptance and peace. As they turned north toward Bar Harbor, Walter glanced at the locket resting on the console between them. The fact that he had found it today, at that exact spot, couldn't be coincidence. Just as it couldn't be coincidence that Rusty or Scout had appeared on Death Curve the night Walter passed by. "Something brought us together," Walter said, looking at Rusty. "Something, or someone." The dog met his gaze briefly before turning back to watch the road ahead, his expression wise and patient, as if he knew exactly where this journey would lead them, and had known all along. The coastal drive to Bar Harbor took nearly 3 hours, winding along the rugged Maine shoreline. Walter had called Martha before leaving Portland to let her know he'd be away overnight with Rusty. She'd sounded concerned, but hadn't asked too many questions, just reminding him to keep the dog's bandages clean and to give him the prescribed pain medication. By the time they reached Bar Harbor, the October afternoon was fading. The tourist season had ended, giving the picturesque town a melancholy emptiness. Shops that would be bustling in summer were closed for the season, their windows dark, while the few remaining visitors huddled in coffee shops to escape the biting ocean wind. Walter checked into the Harbor View Inn, a small bed and breakfast that advertised pet-friendly rooms. The elderly proprietor raised an eyebrow at Rusty's cast but said nothing, as she handed over the key to a ground-floor room with a view of the quiet harbor. "We're looking for someone," Walter told her as he signed the register. "Thomas Harper. I heard he moved here from Portland about 3 years ago." The woman's expression softened with recognition. "Tom Harper. Lives in the Blue Cottage on Spruce Point Road. Keeps to himself mostly." She hesitated. "You're a friend?" "Not exactly," Walter admitted. "But we have a connection. I think he might want to meet Rusty here." After settling Rusty in the room with water and a brief rest, Walter decided to find Thomas Harper immediately rather than waiting until morning. Something about the fading light of the autumn day seemed appropriate for the meeting ahead. Spruce Point Road curved along the eastern shore of the harbor, lined with modest cottages facing the water. The Blue Cottage sat slightly apart from its neighbors, with a small, meticulously maintained garden despite the late season. A weather-beaten rowboat rested upside down in the yard, and smoke curled from the chimney against the darkening sky. Walter parked the Buick and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Rusty, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, perked up immediately, his eyes fixed on the cottage with apparent recognition. "Is this it?" Walter asked. "Is this where he lives?" Rusty's tail thumped against the seat, which Walter had come to interpret as affirmation. The gravel path to the front door seemed endless. Walter's heart pounded as he approached, Rusty limping determinedly beside him. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Thomas Harper stood framed in the doorway, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and the deeply lined face of someone who had endured profound grief. He wore a cable-knit sweater and faded jeans, casual attire that somehow suggested a man who had stopped caring about appearances. His eyes flickered briefly to Walter before fixing on Rusty. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his face draining of color as if he were seeing a ghost. "Scout!" The name escaped him as barely more than a whisper. Rusty, or Scout, responded with a soft whine, his tail wagging slowly, ears perked forward in recognition. Thomas Harper sank to his knees, reaching out with trembling hands. Scout limped forward to meet him, pressing his golden head against the man's chest. Thomas wrapped his arms around the dog, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Walter stood awkwardly, feeling like an intruder on a deeply private reunion. After a few moments, Thomas looked up at him, tears streaming down his weathered face. "How?" he asked simply. "I found him on Seaside Avenue at Death Curve," Walter replied. "A week ago. He'd been hit by a car." Walter hesitated, then admitted the full truth. "My car. It was foggy and I hit him, but I went back the next morning and found him still alive." Thomas absorbed this information with a slow nod, still stroking Scout's fur. After all this time, he murmured. 3 years. He looked up at Walter again. You'd better come inside. We have a lot to talk about. The interior of the cottage was simple but comfortable, with nautical touches that spoke of Thomas's embrace of coastal life. Photos of Sophie and Margaret Harper adorned the mantelpiece, a family now reduced to memories and mementos. Thomas settled Scout on a plaid blanket by the fireplace, examining the cast and bandages with concern. You took care of him, he said to Walter. Thank you for that. Walter sat in an armchair opposite Thomas, the fire crackling between them. I didn't know who he was until recently. I've been calling him Rusty based on a fragment of collar I found. Thomas's brow furrowed. Rusty? Scout never wore a collar with that name. He reached for a framed photo on an end table and handed it to Walter. It showed Sophie with Scout, the green collar clearly visible around the dog's neck. This was taken a week before they disappeared. They? Walter asked. Thomas nodded solemnly. Scout vanished 2 days before the accident. Sophie was devastated. We were out looking for him when... His voice trailed off, the memory still too painful to articulate. Walter reached into his pocket and withdrew the heart-shaped locket he'd found at Death Curve. I found this today, at the Curve, he said, placing it on the coffee table between them. Thomas stared at the locket, his hand shaking as he picked it up. Sophie's, he confirmed. Margaret gave it to her for her 12th birthday. She put Scout's fur inside herself, said it would keep him close to her heart. He looked up sharply. Where exactly did you find this? By the guardrail, partially buried, Walter replied. I don't understand how it got there if Sophie was in the car during the accident. Thomas opened the locket, looking at his daughter's smiling face. She was wearing it that night. The police returned her personal effects afterward, but the locket wasn't among them. I assumed it had been lost in the crash. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Scout's contented sighs as he dozed by the hearth. Both men were puzzling over the same question. How had Scout survived for 3 years only to appear at Death Curve the night Walter was passing by? And how had Sophie's locket remained undiscovered until today? Mr. Harper, Walter began. Thomas, please. Thomas, there's something else you should know. Walter took a deep breath. I lost my wife and son on that same curve 7 years ago. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. You're Walter Sullivan, he said with sudden recognition. I remember reading about your accident when we moved to Portland. It was one of the reasons I was always so careful driving that stretch. His voice grew bitter. Not that it mattered in the end. The two men sat in silence for a moment, united by their shared tragedy. Why did you come looking for me? Thomas finally asked. Walter glanced at Scout, who had opened his eyes and was watching them both attentively. Because I think Scout has been trying to tell me something. About that road, about Sophie, about my family. I can't explain it, but ever since I found him I've felt guided. Rather than dismissing Walter's words as the ramblings of a grieving man, Thomas nodded slowly. Sophie used to say, Scout was magic, he said quietly, that he understood things other dogs didn't. He looked at the golden retriever with sad affection. I never took it seriously until now. As darkness fell outside the cottage windows, the two men began to share their stories, not just of the tragedies that had defined them, but of the lives they had lived before. And through it all, Scout watched and listened, as if waiting for them to discover something they had both been missing for far too long. Morning sunlight streamed through the cottage windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Walter had spent the night in Thomas's spare room, unwilling to leave after their conversation had stretched well past midnight. Scout had slept between their rooms, as if keeping watch over both men. Thomas set a mug of coffee in front of Walter at the kitchen table. Did you sleep? He asked, though the dark circles under Walter's eyes answered the question. Not much, Walter admitted. Too many thoughts. Thomas nodded in understanding. Same here. I keep thinking about Scout, where he's been all this time, how he survived. Scout lay nearby, his head on his paws, watching them with those knowing amber eyes. The dog seemed more at ease in Thomas's cottage, as if he had returned to a place he belonged. "There's something I want to show you," Thomas said after they had finished their coffee. He disappeared into another room and returned carrying a cardboard box labeled Sophie, in careful block letters. Thomas set the box on the table and opened it reverently. "I packed these away when we moved. Couldn't bear to look at them, but couldn't throw them away either." Inside were the treasures of a 12-year-old girl's life. Notebooks with colorful covers, construction paper art projects, a small collection of polished stones, and several framed photographs. Thomas lifted out a spiral-bound journal with butterflies on the cover. "Sophie kept a diary," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "After she died, I read it, trying to, I don't know, hold on to her a little longer." He handed the journal to Walter. "There's something in here you should see." Walter accepted the journal carefully, aware of the sacred trust being placed in him. Thomas flipped it open to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Sophie's handwriting was rounded and neat, with small hearts dotting the I's. April 15th. Had the dream again last night. The one about Scout on the scary road. He wasn't alone this time. There was a man with him, someone I've never seen before. He looked sad, but Scout was helping him. I told Mom about it, but she said it was just a dream. But it doesn't feel like just a dream. It feels important. Walter looked up at Thomas, his pulse quickening. "When did she write this?" "About a month before the accident," Thomas replied. "There are more entries about these dreams." He gently turned a few pages. May 2. Dream about Scout and the sad man again. The man lost someone on the scary road, just like in the other dreams. Scout knows something about it. In the dream, he was trying to bring something to the man, something important that got lost. I wish I could remember what it was when I wake up. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he read. The scary road. She meant Death Curve, didn't she? Thomas nodded. Sophie always hated that stretch of Seaside Avenue, said it felt wrong somehow. I didn't take it seriously, thought it was just typical childhood imagination. His voice broke. If I had listened to her, maybe we wouldn't have been on that road the night of the accident. Scout rose from his place on the floor and limped over to Thomas, resting his head on the man's knee in a gesture of comfort. Thomas absently stroked the dog's ears, drawing strength from his presence. Walter turned more pages in the journal, stopping at an entry dated just 3 days before Sophie's death. May the 27th. Scout is acting strange. He keeps going to the window and staring out at the road. I think he wants to show me something. Dad says we can go for a walk after dinner. I'm going to let Scout lead the way. Maybe then I'll understand what my dreams are trying to tell me. This was the last entry, Thomas said quietly. That night Scout disappeared during their walk. Sophie said he just took off into the woods near Seaside Avenue. We searched everywhere, put up posters, called animal shelters. 2 days later, we were driving along Seaside Avenue, still looking for him, when another car swerved into our lane at the curve. Thomas couldn't continue. Walter closed the journal gently and set it on the table, his mind racing with implications. Sophie had dreamed about a sad man on Death Curve. A man who had lost someone there. A man like Walter. There's more, Thomas said after composing himself. He reached into the box and pulled out a folder of Sophie's drawings. He spread several across the table. Walter's breath caught in his throat. The drawings, done in colored pencil with a child's hand but remarkable attention to detail, showed scenes from Sophie's dreams. In one, Scout stood on Seaside Avenue illuminated by headlights. In another, the dog led a gray-haired man toward something glowing in the distance. But it was the third drawing that made Walter's heart stop. A sketch of a blue Buick, remarkably similar to Walter's car, with a golden retriever sitting in the passenger seat. She drew these weeks before she died, Thomas said quietly. Before she ever met you. Before Scout disappeared. Walter stared at the drawings, unable to speak. The resemblance to his car was uncanny, the depiction of a man who could easily be him unmistakable. There's one more thing, Thomas said, reaching deeper into the box. He withdrew a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a map. Sophie drew this, the day before Scout disappeared. She said it came to her in another dream. Walter unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was a child's rendering of Seaside Avenue, with Death Curve clearly marked by a large X. Along the road were smaller X's, each bearing a date. Walter recognized one immediately, the date of his family's accident 7 years earlier. Another marked the date of Sophie's death, but there were other dates too, some in the past, some yet to come. What does it mean? Walter whispered, staring at the crude map that somehow charted tragedies across time. Scout whined softly, drawing both men's attention. The dog was staring at them intently, as if willing them to understand what Sophie had begun to discover 3 years ago, that Death Curve was more than just a dangerous bend in the road, and that Scout had a purpose that spanned years and connected lives torn apart by tragedy. Walter and Thomas spent the morning poring over Sophie's drawings and journal entries, searching for patterns, clues, anything that might explain the mysterious connection between Scout, Death Curve, and their intertwined tragedies. Scout remained close, moving between the two men as if monitoring their progress, his amber eyes watchful and patient. I still don't understand, Thomas said, rubbing his temples. If Scout knew something about that road, why disappear for 3 years only to show up again when you were passing by? Walter shook his head. And where was he all that time? He's clearly been cared for. He wasn't living as a stray. As if responding to their questions, Scout rose and limped toward Walter, resting his head on the man's knee. Walter absently stroked the dog's head, his fingers tracing the contours of Scout's skull beneath the golden fur. Suddenly he paused. Thomas, did you ever notice this? Walter asked, parting the fur on Scout's head to reveal a small, star-shaped scar partially hidden by his ear. Thomas leaned closer, frowning. No, Scout never had a scar like that when Sophie had him. Martha, my veterinarian, mentioned he might have had another owner, Walter said. This looks like an old injury, but not 3 years old. Thomas gently examined the mark. It almost looks deliberate, doesn't it? Not like an accidental injury. Walter nodded slowly. Almost like a brand. Both men exchanged troubled glances. Who would mark a dog this way? And what did it mean for their understanding of where Scout had been for 3 years? We should call your vet, Thomas suggested. Maybe she can tell us more about this scar. Walter stepped outside to make the call, grateful for the cell reception despite the cottage's remote location. Martha answered on the third ring, her voice brightening when she heard Walter's. How's our patient doing? She asked. Physically, he's improving, Walter replied, but we've discovered something odd. There's a star-shaped scar on his head, partially hidden by his ear. It wasn't from the accident. It's older. A long pause followed. When Martha spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming carefully neutral. You're in Bar Harbor with Thomas Harper, aren't you? Walter nearly dropped the phone. How did you know that? Because I've seen that mark before, on other animals, Martha said quietly. Animals that have disappeared and reappeared near Death Curve. Walter's skin prickled with goosebumps. What are you saying? There's a research center outside of Portland, the Seaside Behavioral Institute. About 4 years ago, they started a project studying animal navigation and intuition. Specifically, they were interested in animals that seemed to anticipate accidents or disasters. Walter glanced back at the cottage window, where he could see Thomas still examining Scout's scar. Are you suggesting Scout was part of some experiment? I'm not suggesting anything definitive, Martha replied cautiously, but I've treated other animals with similar marks, and they all had one thing in common: their owners had lost someone on Seaside Avenue. Walter's mind raced. Do you have any documentation about this institute? Anything concrete? Nothing I can share over the phone, Martha said. But there was a rumor that they were shut down last year after ethical concerns were raised. Walter, be careful. If Scout was part of their program, there may be people looking for him. After hanging up, Walter returned to the cottage, his expression grave as he relayed Martha's information to Thomas. An experiment. Thomas's face darkened with anger. They took Scout for some kind of study about death curve? It would explain where he's been for 3 years, Walter said, but not how he escaped or found his way back to that exact spot when I was driving by. Scout watched them intently, as if following their conversation. When Walter mentioned the Seaside Behavioral Institute, the dog's ears flattened against his head, a reaction that didn't go unnoticed by either man. He understands, Thomas said softly. He always has. Walter knelt beside Scout, looking directly into those intelligent eyes. What happened to you, boy? What did they do to you there? Scout whined softly, then turned and limped to the door, scratching at it with his paw. I think he wants to show us something, Walter said. Thomas grabbed his coat. Then I think we should follow him. Thomas and Walter followed Scout as he limped determinedly down Spruce Point Road toward the harbor. Despite his injuries, the dog moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to ensure the men were still behind him. Should we be letting him walk on that leg? Thomas asked, concerned. Probably not, Walter admitted, but I don't think we could stop him if we tried. They reached Walter's Buick parked outside the Harbor View Inn. Scout sat beside the passenger door, looking expectantly at Walter. I think he wants us to drive somewhere, Walter said, unlocking the car. Thomas helped Scout onto the passenger seat, then slid into the back. I'm guessing we're heading back to Portland. Walter nodded, starting the engine. Back to Death Curve. The journey back felt shorter somehow, as if the road itself were accommodating their urgency. Scout sat alert the entire way, his gaze fixed on the highway ahead. Occasionally he would whine softly when they passed certain landmarks, as if recognizing milestones on a familiar journey. By mid-afternoon they were approaching Seaside Avenue. Walter felt the now familiar tightening in his chest as they neared Death Curve, but it was different this time, less about fear and more about anticipation. What do you think we'll find? Thomas asked from the back seat. I don't know, Walter replied honestly, but Scout does. They pulled onto the shoulder at Death Curve, the same spot where Walter had first found Scout injured. The autumn day was clear, the ocean below sparkling in the afternoon sun, presenting a deceptively peaceful backdrop for the location of so much tragedy. Scout was out of the car the moment Walter opened the door, his three-legged gait surprisingly swift as he headed, not toward the road itself, but toward a narrow path that descended along the cliffside. I didn't know there was a trail here, Walter said as they carefully followed the dog down the steep path. It's an old maintenance access, Thomas explained, used by the highway department to check the cliff stability. The path wound downward for about 50 yards before opening onto a small rocky shelf overlooking the ocean. Scout stopped there, sniffing intently at the ground before looking up at the two men expectantly. What is it, boy? Walter asked, kneeling beside the dog. What are we looking for? Scout began pawing at a particular spot where debris had collected against the cliff face. Fallen leaves, twigs, and sand blown up from the beach below. Walter and Thomas knelt and began clearing away the debris. There's something here, Thomas said suddenly, his fingers brushing against something solid beneath the sand. Together they uncovered a small metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book, partially rusted from exposure but still intact. A faded label on its side read SBI, Subject 7. Seaside Behavioral Institute, Walter said quietly, exchanging a glance with Thomas. Thomas pried open the box carefully. Inside was a waterproof case containing several items: a notebook with the SBI logo, a USB drive, and a dog collar, worn and faded, but with the name Rusty clearly visible on the tag. "So there was a Rusty," Walter murmured, examining the collar. Thomas opened the notebook, scanning the first page. "These are research notes," he said, his voice tightening with barely controlled anger. "They were using Scout as a test subject. Something about post-trauma animal navigation patterns and proximity sensing to sites of emotional disturbance." Walter looked at Scout, who was watching them with those knowing eyes. "They were studying his connection to Death Curve," he said. "They must have taken him after he disappeared from your walk with Sophie." "But why?" Thomas asked, flipping through more pages. "Why would they—" He stopped suddenly, his face paling as he stared at something in the notebook. "What is it?" Walter asked. Thomas turned the notebook so Walter could see. There, paper-clipped to one of the pages, was a newspaper clipping about Walter's accident 7 years earlier, the crash that had killed Elizabeth and Michael. Below it, a handwritten note read, "Subject 7 continues to show strong navigational pull toward Sullivan accident site. Recommend Phase 2 testing to begin immediately." "They were using my family's death as part of their research," Walter said, his voice hollow with shock. "And somehow Scout was connected to it even before he disappeared from Sophie." The implications hung in the air between them as Scout whined softly, seemingly relieved that they had found the box he had led them to. The mystery was deepening, but now they had concrete evidence of the connection between Scout, Death Curve, and the tragedies that had altered both their lives forever. Back at Thomas's cottage in Bar Harbor, Walter connected the USB drive they'd found to his laptop. Scout lay between them on the floor, watching attentively as the screen flickered to life, displaying a folder labeled Subject 7, Retriever. "Are you sure you want to see what's on this?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Walter nodded grimly. "We need to know the truth." "All of it." The files contained research data, observation notes, and videos documenting Scout's time at the Seaside Behavioral Institute. The first entry was dated just days after Scout's disappearance from Sophie's walk. "Initial subject acquisition successful," Walter read aloud, disgust evident in his voice. "Subject retrieved from Seaside Avenue following reported gravitational anomaly signals." Thomas leaned forward. "Gravitational anomaly? What does that mean?" Walter scrolled through more documents until he found a research summary. According to this, the Institute was originally studying unusual electromagnetic and gravitational readings along Death Curve. They discovered that certain animals, especially dogs, reacted strongly to these anomalies. "You're saying there's something physically unusual about that stretch of road?" Thomas asked. "More than unusual," Walter replied, opening a video file. "They believe Death Curve exists at what they called a temporal fold, a place where time isn't quite linear." The video showed Scout in a sterile laboratory environment, electrodes attached to his head. Researchers were monitoring his reactions as they played sounds recorded at Death Curve. Scout's response was unmistakable, alert, focused, as if hearing something beyond the recorded audio. "They theorized that certain animals can sense these disruptions," Walter continued, reading from another document, "and that Scout was particularly sensitive because—" He stopped, his face paling as he read the next lines. "Because what?" Thomas pressed. Walter looked up, his eyes haunted. "Because Scout was present at 2 major temporal events on Death Curve. Sophie's accident and somehow my family's accident 7 years earlier." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. We only got Scout for Sophie's 10th birthday, 3 years before her accident. He couldn't have been at your family's crash." Walter opened another video file. This one showed researchers interviewing a familiar figure, Eleanor Simmons, the elderly woman from the neighborhood near Death Curve. Ms. Simmons confirms Subject 7 was observed at multiple accident sites along Seaside Avenue over the past decade. Read the accompanying notes, including the Sullivan crash in 2018, despite the dog not being officially adopted by the Harper family until 2022. "How is that possible?" Thomas whispered. Walter opened a final document, a research conclusion marked classified. "Our findings suggest that Subject 7 exists in a unique temporal state, able to navigate between specific points in the time-space continuum centered around death curve. The dog appears to be attempting to prevent accidents by appearing to potential victims, though with limited success. Further study required to determine if this ability can be harnessed or replicated." Scout whined softly, drawing both men's attention. The dog was looking at them with an intensity that seemed almost human. "He's been trying to help," Walter said quietly, reaching out to stroke Scout's golden head. "All this time appearing at accidents, trying to warn people." "Including Sophie," Thomas added, his voice breaking. "He wasn't running away that night. He was trying to keep her away from the curve." Walter nodded slowly, a final piece falling into place. "And he found me again to help me face what happened to Elizabeth and Michael. Not just because I hit him with my car, but because he was there 7 years ago, trying to warn us too." Thomas looked at the star-shaped mark on Scout's head. "So the Institute captured him, studied him, and marked him. But how did he escape? And why find you now, after all this time?" Walter scanned through more files until he found an incident report dated 3 months earlier. Subject 7 escaped during transport, after facility closure ordered by Ethics Board. Search teams unable to locate subject despite tracking implant. "He's been free for 3 months, Thomas said, "waiting for the right moment to find you." Walter looked at Scout, who met his gaze steadily. "Not just to find me," he said quietly. "To bring us together. Both of us who lost someone at Death Curve." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, a confirmation. "But why?" Thomas asked. "What can we possibly do now?" The answer came as Scout rose and limped to the cottage door, scratching insistently. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the porch. "I think," Walter said, rising from his chair, "he wants us to go back to Death Curve one more time." 1 year later, Walter stood at the edge of Death Curve, watching as workers installed a new safety barrier along the dangerous stretch of Seaside Avenue. The autumn sun glinted off the freshly painted guardrails and illuminated the memorial plaque that now stood at the curve's apex. "They did a good job," Thomas said, coming to stand beside him. "The road hasn't claimed anyone since the improvements began." Walter nodded, his gaze drifting to the small stone marker beneath the plaque, where the names of those lost at Death Curve were engraved: Elizabeth and Michael Sullivan, Sophie Harper, and 17 others over the decades. Fresh flowers adorned the memorial, a reminder that healing didn't mean forgetting. "Scout would approve," Walter said with a small smile. As if summoned by his name, Scout appeared from around the bend, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, his limp barely noticeable now. The dog trotted up to them, tail wagging, a stick in his mouth. An ordinary dog enjoying an ordinary day, yet so much more. After their final visit to Death Curve a year ago, something had changed. Scout had led them to the exact spot where both accidents had occurred. And there, as the sun set over the Atlantic, they had experienced something neither man could fully explain. A moment when the veil between past and present seemed to thin. Walter had felt Elizabeth and Michael's presence. Thomas had sensed Sophie. No words had been exchanged. No ghostly apparitions witnessed. Just a profound sense of connection. And finally, permission to move forward. The Seaside Behavioral Institute's research had been turned over to authorities, its experiments on animals shut down permanently. Walter and Thomas had ensured Scout's story became part of the evidence, though they kept the more inexplicable aspects to themselves. Now, Walter lived in a cottage not far from Thomas's in Bar Harbor. The two men, once strangers connected only by tragedy, had formed a bond that went beyond friendship. They were family now, united by their shared experiences and by Scout, who divided his time between their homes. Walter had emerged from his 7-year isolation to establish the Death Curve Safety Initiative, which had finally secured funding for the road improvements they were witnessing today. Thomas had returned to teaching, finding joy again in sharing knowledge with young minds eager to learn. "Ready to go?" Thomas asked, checking his watch. "Martha's flight lands in an hour." Walter nodded, giving the memorial one last glance before turning away. Martha Henderson had become a regular visitor to Bar Harbor, her professional interest in Scout having evolved into something more personal, especially where Walter was concerned. As they walked back to Walter's Buick, Scout trotting between them, Walter felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The weight of guilt and grief hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something he could carry without being crushed. "You know," Walter said as they reached the car, "I still don't fully understand what Scout is or how he connected us across time." Thomas smiled, watching as the dog jumped into the back seat, settling comfortably on the blanket laid out for him. "Maybe we're not meant to understand everything. Maybe it's enough to know that love and Scout found a way to bring healing when we needed it most." Walter nodded, glancing once more at Death Curve in his rearview mirror as they drove away. The road behind them was part of their past now, not a barrier to their future. Ahead lay a life neither man had imagined possible a year ago. One with friendship, purpose, and the extraordinary golden retriever who had guided them from darkness into light.